Today I'll be talking about my testing and thoughts on Set 1 Teemo post Houston. So first, I'll go over what I felt like were the biggest issues with the deck. Then I'll go over what improvement goals I had in mind. And lastly, I'll go over what I actually did and tried to achieve them. To put my changes to the test, I went to 2 Summoner Skirmishes this past week, and I ended up winning both. I had slightly different lists for each one, and I'll talk about my thoughts going into both of them. Anyways, let's get into it. So I'm going to list some of the main problems I found with the deck, both in Houston and just kind of thinking about it afterwards. So firstly, I've noticed we have a really strong game 1 most of the time because of Dreaming Tree and how much synergy it has with a lot of the cards we're running. But after that, game 2 and 3, sometimes it kind of felt a little bricky, especially if we just didn't draw very well. Like if we don't draw our stacked decks, our stupefies, our consult the pass, I feel like sometimes we end up with a dead hand pretty often. Another issue I found was there's just way too many sideboard slots allocated for matchups that are already good. So for example, cards like Convergent Mutation and Smokescreen, although they're both good cards in pretty much every matchup, you generally would side them in for the more combat style matchups like Set, Yi, just matchups like that where, the might swings are really important. But honestly, we already have really good matchups into all of those decks. So it kind of felt like our sideboard slots were not being used as effectively as they should have been. And my last big problem is the Kaisa matchup still just felt a little too shaky. Like, I know no matter how we build Teemo, Kaisa will still probably just beat us most of the time. But it felt like there was definitely some optimizations to be made and some tools that maybe I wasn't fully exploring to just have an even better edge versus Kaisa. Alright, so what are the improvement goals given these problems that I had? So the first goal I had was to improve the just overall consistency of the deck after Dreaming Tree is gone. So, after we lose Dreaming Tree, like, what can we add in to pretty much just make our deck more smooth, make sure we're finding the answers we need, and just the cards that we actually need to play, like making sure we can consistently find them more often, right? Because it just felt like after Dreaming Tree is gone, like we just don't have a really consistent draw engine, except for hoping we draw stacked decks, hoping we can hide Consult the Past, and yeah. The second goal I had was to revamp our sideboard to just mostly take out the quote-unquote useless pieces. I'm mainly talking about Convergent Mutation and Smokescreen, as those are like kind of just the 2 main cards that would free up slots to put in just cards that either improve the consistency or help us in more common matchups. So to add on to that, goal number 3 is I think we should tech out even more for decks like Annie and Kaisa, right? Especially after Houston. I think, Annie especially is going to be on the rise. Kaisa, although didn't finish too hot, I think there's still just way too many Kaisa players and people that like the deck, that the deck will stay popular. And yeah, there might be a surgence of Yi as well, but that's great for us. So I'm not too worried about that. All right, so let's get into how to actually achieve these goals. So what I decided to do was I wanted to test other really strong cards that are generally good in Teemo and kind of what the trade-off is of including those over other cards. So the main cards I was actually thinking about for this are Invert Timelines, Guerrilla Warfare, and Singularity. I think these 3 cards, I've tested a lot with them in the past, and they were in my decks at numerous times while I was playing Teemo, but I just felt like they didn't do enough. But I think there is definitely potential there, especially if I change around some other aspects of my deck, right, like battlefields or free up some slots, right? So yeah, that was something I really wanted to explore. So I also wanted to test some generally strong Teemo battlefields that I've didn't run with at Houston. For example, I think Trifarian Warcamp is an amazing battlefield, especially into Kaisa, that I was running, but I decided to cut it out because I felt like it also kind of can sometimes backfire on you, especially in other matchups. But since we're running 3 Gust, there's a lot of times where the War Camp would just put like push this Raven Bloom over the, over 3-4 might, and we just gonna Gust it, or things like that. So I think to maximize the Kai'Sa matchup, you should probably run this, and I think that's probably over, over something like Grove, or even over something like Hillock. I think Hillock kind of has a similar idea of like being better in the Kai'Sa matchups or the Annie matchup, where you can play with the Ride the Wind, but I feel like sometimes it doesn't come up enough for it to be better than some of the other options. So I was heavily thinking about War Camp. Another battlefield I wanted to consider was Bandletree. Very obvious choice, but I was thinking about playing Bandletree with some sideboarded hidden cards or things like Guerrilla Warfare inside to kind of help you after you side out some of your Dreaming Tree synergistic cards, to kind of help you just synergize with Bandletree even more and benefit a lot more from being able to hide an additional card. So this is actually one of the battlefields that I ended up going with, so I'll get into that later. So the last step to this was to compare some of the current existing cards in battlefields and how they could be better, right? Or what could take their place. So the main standouts for me was Ride the Wind. I felt like this card, although it's very strong and we rely on it heavily late game, it would just break your hand too much. There were definitely some games where I had 2 to 3 copies of my starting hand, or not my starting hand, but like after the first few turns, and I'm just like, well, I'm not going to play this until like turn 5, turn 6, and it's just a dead card. So I think 3, like, it's nice to have the consistency of having 3, and it's nice to be able to score on your opponent's turn sometimes, but it is kind of gimmicky, and I felt like the better your opponents are, the easier it is for them to play around this card. So I think cutting down to 2 is definitely reasonable. I think 2 is still consistent enough where you'll find it most of the time near the end of the game, and it won't break your hand as much. So I think going down to 2 Ride the Wind is definitely good, and it's what I ended up doing. Another card I considered removing was honestly Consult the Past. This is an amazing card, don't get me wrong, but game 1 with Dreaming Tree, it felt like we had more than enough draw, and Consult the Past just wasn't even being that relevant. Sometimes you just rather hide a lot more, or you'd rather just hide cards that are a lot more useful and can actually impact the board. Consult the Past doesn't really do that unless you have Raven Bloom, but or an Ember Monk, I guess, but like any other hidden card would do the same. I think 1 copy can go to the sideboard, especially game 1 with Dreaming Tree. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but cards like Convergent Mutation and Smokescreen are just kind of, I feel like they're just too weak to, they're just too redundant. We already have good matchups into the decks where we'd side these in, so I want to definitely free up these slots. Alright, so this was the first list I came up with, pretty much a week after Houston, I believe. This was last weekend. So the main differences are playing Bandletree instead of Hillock, and Rebuke in main deck, Invert Timelines in main deck, only 2 copies of Ride the Wind, and 2 copies of Consult the Past. So this deck felt better than Houston by a good amount. And I think the main reasons for that was honestly just the sideboarded Guerrilla Warfare and the Bandletree instead of Hillock. I know I criticized Bandletree a bit by being like, okay, well, you need to control the battlefield to actually use it. And, Kai'Sa and Annie won't give you a lot of opportunities to do that. But I think by having all of these mid-game sprite options to take control of battlefields, it becomes a little bit easier. And especially if, you do get to reclaim a battlefield, you get a lot of value out of hiding, and being able to save your Ember Monks, for example, can be very helpful, right? By just putting it at 8 might, putting out a range of Falling Star, like, it's just super good. Guerrilla Warfare in particular came into play a lot versus the non-Kaisa decks, right? By just returning like 2 fighter flights to your hand is just so insane late game. But even versus Kaisa, it was helpful. Pretty much for the same scenario. I think usually like if you're playing Guerrilla Warfare, it's either mid game and you want to hide like more Consult the Pass or like another Teemo, for example, and that's fine. But it's really strong late game when you've used fighter flights already and you just like you've already used 2 and then you bring 2 back and you get to play like 4 fighter flights in one game, right? Like that's insane. So that was the main purpose of Guerrilla Warfare, and yeah, I think it's just a really solid card that definitely deserves a spot, you know, in one of these 48 cards. So basically the main game plan with this deck is obviously you're going to open Dreaming Tree, and once you don't have it anymore, you're going to side out a lot of your Dreaming Tree cards, like usually Retreat if you're not versus Kaisa, Flash depending on the matchup, you know, Gust depending on the matchup, or you know, whatever other just cards are just not as good depending on the matchup. And if you're going first, you're going to go God Willow, and if you're going second, you're going to go Bandle Tree. So obviously the idea is like, okay, yes, we play Bandle Tree, and then we side in, you know, our Guerrilla Warfare and our Consult the Past, maybe our Sprite Call if it's good in the matchup, and we just play with more hidden cards, and so we can find them more consistently. But even if you go Grove, I think there is a lot of value in siding out the Guerrilla Warfare and the Consult the Past, just once again, depending on the matchup. I know Grove is potentially not our best option versus Kaisa. I did notice that I procced it, you know, definitely a few times, and Kaisa only would proc it like a few times as well. It kind of just depends on, you know, how strong their start is and how strong yours is, but it can definitely bite you in the ass. I noticed my locals doesn't have as much Kaisa, and there's a lot more Yi and Annie, so I thought Grove would be a better choice for my locals, but I do think there is merit in replacing this with a War Camp, especially if there is a lot of Kaisa in your locals. So I just wanted to preface that because my next list also includes Grove, and the reasoning is mostly just because I didn't expect there to be a lot of Kaisa. I'm going to show my matchups on my screen, but I did end up playing versus a good amount of Kaisa. Overall, I felt like the matchup was pretty similar to how it was in Houston. These changes didn't help that much with Kaisa. I think the biggest thing that helped was the invert timelines, and being able to throw away their hand when they had like a huge hand of answers definitely came into play a few times. I also think the Bandle Tree with Ember Monks was probably more relevant than the ganking battlefield that I was running at Houston. I think just having 8 Might Ember Monks, although like you may not get it early or you may not get it consistently, just having the option to do it can really make Kaisa's life difficult, right? Like, can't Falling Star it, she has to, you know, a Cathian Rain will only knock out 1.5 if you have 2, for example, and you don't even need to control both battlefields. So I think Bandle Tree is definitely strong and deserves a spot, especially if we're running Guerrilla Warfare. Alright, so this is my most recent deck list. It's the one that I won a skirmish with yesterday as of recording. It's really similar to my last list, and basically the only difference is I added in a Singularity in the main deck instead of Invert Timelines, and I put Invert Timelines in the side deck. Initially there was a Sprite Mother here, I believe, an extra Sprite Mother, so I just replaced the Sprite Mother with Invert Timelines and then Invert Timelines with Singularity. So yeah, very similar list, still on 2 Ride the Wind, still on 2 Consult the Past main deck. The idea behind this was I wanted to play Invert Timelines, usually not in game 1, due to them just being able to draw all my answers and just have a very large hand that I didn't want to discard. But having it in game 2 and 3 was very helpful, especially when Kaisa would draw more cards than us by just having more cycle in her deck without relying on battlefields. So putting this in my sideboard I think was definitely the correct option. It did still come up a lot versus Kaisa and, you know, versus other decks as well. But yeah, I think this is a pretty good card. So why Singularity? I was low-key a hater of this card because so many people asked, why aren't you running it? And I was running it initially, but I did feel like it just wasn't that useful, especially when you were behind. It felt decent if you had a board to play with, right? Like you could maybe just nuke a couple of units, right? Especially versus Kaisa, like you can nuke a Hopeful and a Darius, or, you know, a Kaisa and a Darius or something like that, right? And like that's pretty good value. but I just didn't like how expensive it was and how bad it felt to play when you didn't really have units to use. However, after trying it out, I definitely think it has potential. It came up like once or twice in my matches. I played against like 5 Ys or like Aurora decks, and I only played against Kaisa once in the finals. But there was one time specifically where in game 1, I had control of one of the battlefields. Kaisa did not have enough units to overtake that battlefield, so Kaisa basically just spent a turn developing by playing Darius in base, Noxus Hopeful in base, and passing over to me. And I basically just went Singularity, play like a Raven Bloom, and pass back to them. And at that point, the game was basically over because they just didn't have the units to ever overtake that battlefield. And so that was where Singularity was very relevant. I ended up signing it out after game 1 just because I felt like I had more useful cards in the matchup, like the Sprite Call, Lecturing Yordle, since I ended up winning the first game, and you know, the hidden package is also pretty good to help us with our consistency and of course invert timelines. So I think signing it out was pretty smart too, because I kind of noticed they were never playing 2 mid-sized units for pretty much game 2 and game 3 because they were just scared of Singularity. And I think it's a good card to catch a lot of players off guard in game 1 because they might think like, oh, maybe they don't run it, maybe they do, right? But then the moment you show it to them, they're going to be aware of it for the rest of the best of 3. So I think that was pretty good, and I think I would consider keeping this in the main deck as a one of just for that scenario. But I still do feel like it's just not the best card, especially when you're behind. So otherwise, fantastic card. Probably going to keep this as a one of in main deck at the very least. I'm not too sure what else I would change here, but yeah, the idea is pretty much the same as I explained before. You're just going to be siding in Warfare, Consult the Past after game 1, most likely pretty much versus every deck. I think you'd probably want Warfare even if you don't have Bandle Tree, because even on your Grove game, like your draw won't be as consistent, and Guerrilla Warfare can help you get a lot of value both as a late game top deck or as like a mid game. Let's hide another Consult the Past, right? So I think Warfare is just a really good card outside of game 1, where you have enough cards to just have all your answers, and you don't need to go through your trash to play them again. Anyways, that's my deck. Feel free to comment down below, you know, cards you would change, things you would consider, other questions you have. I'll always try to answer as many as I can. Please consider liking and subscribing if you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribing especially helps my channel a lot since I'm new. It helps me put out a lot more free content for you guys, so if you guys are liking the content, please consider subscribing. I'm not too sure if I'm going to do more set 1 or set 2 content. I can definitely do more like matchup stuff or pivot into doing some more set 2 testing and getting a head start on that since I'll be going to Vegas. But I'm also considering going to some like 5K, 10Ks during set 1, so let me know what you guys prefer down below. I'm also going to start opening up some live coaching sessions. I'm going to start pretty small, maybe doing like once or twice a week, and we'll go from there. But if you're interested in that, please follow me on Twitter. That's probably where I'll post any updates to that. Otherwise, yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. See you next time.